session on a hugely important topic, collaboration in a more contested world. I was saying to the organizers, I feel like it's a most contested world, not just a more contested world. I'm Mina Al-Araibi, editor of The National based here in the UAE, and delighted to be partnering with the World Economic Forum on this session. Time and again, we mention that we live in a world where we have 20th century frameworks that don't feel fit for purpose for the 21st century challenges, but also opportunities that confront us. We meet, of course, in the Middle East, where it is a very difficult time, a contested time, with war and question marks about the future of Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, and other countries that are suffering at this time, but also the Middle East that has incredible opportunity from the UAE's advancements in AI to incredible, not only economic, but entrepreneurial and educational advances in countries such as these. In Europe, the war in Ukraine continues. In the US, there are question marks about the future of the elections, and the list goes on. At the same time, there are question marks about how we can get new ways of collaboration when we haven't succeeded in getting close or even close enough to meeting the aspirations of the SDGs. Only 5 years from now, we will mark the 2030 milestone, and unfortunately, we wouldn't have met the promise of the SDGs. So what we need to think about is what are those systems and what are those ways of collaboration that can cut through all these many challenges and developments. I'm delighted to have a wonderful panel who will talk us through some of these ideas in only 43 minutes or so we should be fine. So immediately to my left is Florence Gopp, Director of the Research Division at the NATO Defense College. We have here Sarah Thorne, Vice President of Global Government Affairs at Walmart. Theo Liu, who is founder and CEO of Wusawa Advisory and also a fellow Young Global Leader based in Beijing. And we have Danny Kuo, who is Dean and Professor in Economics at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. So for housekeeping, this is live streamed, and if you'd like to be part of this conversation, you can use the hashtag of AMGFC24, and we will see your remarks after the live stream also. So I want to start with you, Florence. How would you describe this geopolitical moment?
I think what we're experiencing is a conflation of different fundamental changes in society, what in the 70s was called the future shock by Alvin Toffler, a famous futurist, and we're going through a phase like that again. So we have fundamental changes in the environment, of course, in the economic sector, so the structure of economy is changing, the AI, et cetera, knowledge society and so forth. We have demographic changes, so a lot is changing at the same time. And humans don't like change, but they're actually very good at it. Still, it's traumatic. And then on top of that, you have, beyond this, I think, conventional understanding of the tensions that we see in the system as about power, I see it as a struggle over what future do we actually want to achieve. And you have different proposals. We have Xi Jinping is actually in office with a very strong future-oriented narrative. We have other actors, including Russia, for instance, saying, well, we don't want the system of the future to be what it used to be like. So the whole conversation is actually very future-oriented, and the tension that we see, to me, is the result of disagreement over how do we solve all these challenges, and then what is the result that we want to end up with. And I think that's the pain that everybody's feeling. The good news is future shocks come to an end at some point, but we're not there yet.
Danny, what does the future look like, and how do you think of this geopolitical moment?
I'd like to build on what you, Mina, said in your introduction and what Florence just said, where you used the word future shock and contestation. That is a description of the world that we're in now. And while we're worrying about all these forward-looking potentials that might develop, I also think that there are bread and butter issues that make the world contested today. I mean, obviously, there are visible manifestations in wars that are broken out in different parts of the world. And even in places where there are not outright wars, there's a simmering tension beneath the surface. So that is a characterization. But there are also shocks. For the longest time, we thought of the world as holding together, despite all these potentials for being driven apart, all these possibilities for global fragmentation, identity, ideology, class division, civilizational, all that continued to operate. But today, we have new shocks. I mean, those new shocks include contestation over environmental, pandemic issues. There are also contestation over economics. And this is a total surprise. For the longest time, we thought whatever the ideological difference between, for instance, China and the United States, economics would hold the world together because we had built a wonderful global supply chain. It would be too costly to decouple. All of that was a glue that held the world together. But that is now being undermined. It's undermined by an appreciation of how the lived experience of Americans, for instance, of the so-called China shock, where they view trade and economic exchange with China now as China stealing their jobs, dismantling their industry, turning into ghost towns what were once thriving middle-class American communities. And this turn away from the glue that economic trade ought to be bringing the world together. That is, I think, is profoundly new in the contestation in the world today.
I want you to elaborate on this point. There is the individual sense that jobs are being taken away. We see more xenophobia rising. I think we also went through a moment where we felt that mobility and migration was always going to be encouraged, maybe in the 1990s to the 2000s, and we see a turn away from that. So what is mainly driving that? Is it how people personally are reacting to these developments, or is it government decisions?
You're right, to drive towards what appears to be a paradox. Whether it's immigration or trade, these things were supposed to be win-win. In fact, a fundamental tenet of the way the world has conducted business for the last 2 centuries is that international trade was win-win. If I were to deny that, they would take away my license as an economist. I continue to believe that. However, at the same time that this is win-win for entire nations, it's not the lived experience of ordinary people. What ordinary people see is that the prices of the products that they're selling is now undercut by global competition. That is the critical observation that we have not been able to repair. And I think going forwards, what policy needs to do is to focus on that. Not trade deficits, not sanctions. It's how we make ordinary people feel once again that they are not insecure in a world where economic exchange is free.
But what we're actually seeing is that governments of major economies are going for protectionist tariffs and policies to try to address some of that, rather than addressing the lived life, as you mentioned it, Danny. So Tian, I'd like to ask you, I mean, what is this effect of increasingly protectionist trade policies, and how do we move away from that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And at different historic times, I would say actually the cause and the result of your question would be very different. So let's say 20 years ago, 24 years ago, when China just joined WTO, at that time, China's GDP was only 4% of the world, and now it's close to 20%. So at that time, it was the trade system that changed the geopolitical or geoeconomic landscape. But nowadays, especially the past 5, close to 10 years' time, we're seeing the reverse of that. So it's not because of the trade that's changing geopolitics, but really it's because of the shifting in the geopolitical landscape that we're seeing that different countries are starting to use trade and many other tools as a way to enforce their influence and to enforce their differences in opinions. And Danny and I were from the Council of Geopolitics. It's so interesting that whichever other council that we go to, people will constantly ask about, especially US-China relationships and the changing geopolitical landscape, because that is literally fitting into everything. It's not just trade, it's not just investment. We're also talking about climate. We're talking about technology differences. We're talking about securities and military, geopolitical, and then all of the above. So I'd say it started with the shift. So, Florence used the word change. Danny used the word shock. I'd rather use disruption. So the rise of China has been disruption rather than a shock, especially because shock kind of sounds a bit negative, and disruption is a big difference. It's a change, it's a disruption. So how does China try to find its new position in the world, and also how do the rest of the world try to accept, if not welcome, the rise of China? I'd also argue that's quite important.
But China's also in a very interesting time because I think the rise, people continue to expect that there's going to be this continuous rise, and it's at a different stage now than, again, if we were having this conversation 5 years ago. And we also see the rise of India, which here in the UAE, we really see that, and we see the strength of the economy and also innovation and so forth that's coming out from India. So with that disruption, the change, and looking towards the future, how do you see these major economies, again, that change? How do countries that are perhaps used to being the major drivers of economic change, particularly the US, deal with that?
Right. So let's start with US, China, and then maybe China and the other countries. So if China continued to grow at somewhere between 3 to 5% of GDP a year, then China will overtake US as the largest economy in the next 10 to 15 years' time, basically. Obviously, we can talk about different scenarios. So that's one. But that itself is not important enough because that's just economic powers. There are so many other soft powers, geopolitical, military, securities, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that. And it's also important to know of where the Chinese economy is going. While it's the second largest economy, still there are more than 10 years for China to go. But another way to look at it is the sheer size of it. It is the total combination of number 3, 4, 5, 6 economies combined. So that's very sizable. So for other countries to say, okay, forget about China, look at me instead, we're so important, we're growing very fast, that's going to take some other time. So in a way, still the most interesting bilateral is economic and geopolitical bilateral relationship is US and China.
And of course, major multinational companies have to be able to operate and thrive in this sort of contested world that we're witnessing. So Sarah, I want to ask you the effect of these increasingly protectionist policies from major economies. How does that affect the private sector and multinational companies?
Yeah, so it's been a challenging couple of years for global companies. If you think of the pandemic, if you think of the shocks that we've seen, kinetic and then geopolitical tensions, what it means for us is we just have to be more agile in our supply chains. We have to be thinking about resilience. We have to be thinking about how do we make sure we have, if option A is no longer an option for sourcing, where's option B? So we've spent a lot of time at Walmart thinking about surety of supply and about how do we make sure we have the products that our customers need. We're the largest food grocer in the world. People think of us mostly as, general merchandise, but we actually provide an essential service, which is food, and that's really important to make sure we have on our shelves. But what that means is you're really thinking about efficiencies versus, costs, because there are costs in actually having to build supply chains everywhere when you have so much disruption and uncertainty. There's a benefit, though, too, and we think about this deglobalization, but I would say the benefit is there are opportunities for other countries that might not have been there before, because companies like mine and other companies are looking at other sources of supply, other opportunities to build supply chains, and other opportunities to ensure we have resilience. So while we feel incredibly frustrated, because in some ways businesses are kind of collateral damage, as governments decide what they want to do, we have to adapt, we have to adjust. I think the challenge for us is business loves certainty. We love predictability. It's the guiding star. And for as long as I've been doing trade policy, that's what trade policy was. It was rules and norms and just all the good stuff that we really spent my whole life trying to build and advocate for. And I actually still believe it's like democracy. Like, is there a better system than global norms and rules for predictability and certainty and for opportunity? Because while a company like mine may be able to pivot and be agile, there are a lot of small businesses out there that were really benefiting from a global rules-based system. And I think that, for me, it's personally saddening that that trust and that opportunity is actually going to be harder for those smaller businesses out there in smaller economies. And I just had one thing to say, Jenny, about China and trade and protectionism, which is, I think we're forgetting about automation. I think it's really easy to say trade ate my job, But when we actually look at it, automation ate a lot of jobs. And if we look about manufacturing and advanced manufacturing, it's going to be less people and more machines. So I do think we need to have an honest conversation about trade. We see a lot of conversations about trade and tariffs. I've never seen a tariff really bring back a lot of jobs. You know, it just really increases costs and costs for customers, and quite frankly, costs for businesses.
May I say I completely agree with what Sarah just said. My statement about the China shock is one about that's not meant to be a judgmental statement, whether that's right or wrong. It's a statement about what actually people perceive.
Yeah.
And that perception is very unfortunately manipulated by populist wannabe leaders. It's manipulated by some of the social media and some of the traditional media. And it's very unfortunately led to fractured societies across the world. No country has been safe from this kind of propagation of fake information. But the perception, I think you would agree with me, is there. And honest accounting is that technology does as much of a job in all of these as trade. But nobody, no political leader I know goes out there and says, well, it's the robots that you need to be railing against. Instead, it's China that's the enemy.
Florence, I mean, Sarah raised the point, and Danny actually also raised this point, that there were things that we took for granted, trade norms that we took for granted. WTO moment, you know, there's this idea China joins WTO, fall of the Soviet Union, capitalism is on the rise, and we're all going to fall in lockstep. And the world's changed, but not only in trade, but also in politics. And I think there are, again, norms and international humanitarian law, for example, Geneva Conventions, things that we've taken as at least a basis for which the world should be governed by, are really under stress, if not altogether discarded. So how do we get away from that? What do we do to be able to find, even if they're new norms, but at least to have some sort of norms or rules of the game that we can all adhere to?
So this is a very interesting question, because essentially you're asking an almost philosophical question, which is, does humanity progress towards something better? And I looked at surveys the other day. In Germany, the numbers go like this, like from the 50s to today. 1 year, 73% say, yes, we believe in progress, and then 5 years later, it's just 39%. And I think that's probably an accurate reflection of how everybody feels, because that progress is not so easy to be seen. Part of the problem is that it's complex. The world is huge, and data sets are massive now. I'll give you one example of how the way you present data can skew your perception. You've all heard that this year we broke the record. We never have had so many conflicts as now since World War II. In numbers terms, that's correct, but it's completely accurate to give the perception that we've never had as many deaths, because in terms of lethality, we are 25% of what we had civilian casualties in 1996. Right, so the so-called 90s, that now everybody seems to agree were apparently such a great decade, I think the people who think that suffer from severe nostalgia. The 1990s were the genocide in Rwanda. It was Chechnya, where Russia could do whatever it wanted and killed loads of people in Grozny. It was the Balkan Wars. It was HIV. It was also, and I can go on. So I think the first thing to do is do not buy the narrative that we live in a uniquely bad time. We live in a bad time in the sense that we have loads of things to solve, but it doesn't mean that everything's gotten worse. And then actually we have made a lot of progress in a lot of fields, but of course that doesn't mean that we don't have challenges left. So I think for everybody who is a bit of an overload over this, like everything's getting worse, I invite you to check out the book Factfulness, which shows that a lot of things have gotten better. Maybe look at the data and then look actually at what the challenges are. Now when it comes to norms, my conviction is that thanks to social media, I used to work a lot on the Middle East, and I looked at Lebanon, the pictures of Lebanon. I wondered what makes this war different from 2006. People like you and I, we have witnessed directly conflict in the Middle East for decades. What makes it different this time is social media. In 2006, you didn't have Instagram. You had filters. You had journalists filtering what we saw across the world. And now we're beginning to see an emerging, I would say, a universal consensus that civilians, whether they're Palestinians, Lebanese, or Israelis, they should not die in conflict. And that's, I find, honestly, it's in this time of despair, I think that gives me hope. Now, it's not changing policies. It's not ending wars yet. but it still shows that there are certain things that we can all agree on. So maybe take home that message that I think the norms, while far from being accomplished, the norms themselves, the ideal that we want, is not undermined. And maybe if I can just add to that, I'm a science fiction fan. I look at a lot of old science fiction. The ideals of what humans want are pretty consistent since science fiction started in the late 19th century across all cultures. So maybe we hold on to that light in the darkness of this decade.
Light in the darkness is always one that we need. And to your point, individual moral values and belief systems are important. Danny, another big change that's happened in the world is the rise of middle powers. And I think, again, sitting here in the UAE, you're based in Singapore, I mean, there's a different perspective, be it about US-China or be it about actually what norms are acceptable or not. So where do middle powers come into this contested world?
Okay. It really resonates with me, the way you asked that question, exactly as you say, UAE, Singapore. But I might reframe it slightly, if I may. I prefer not the term middle powers, but third nations. Middle powers buys into a narrative that says there's a hierarchy of power, and we look to the great powers to solve the world's problems, but once they fail, well, it's now the time of the middle powers to step up and take charge. And so that gives rise to a view of the world as being hierarchical, whereas hierarchical in power in particular. And yeah, the world would be hierarchical in power
Is the world not hierarchical
if we believe
in
that
power?
might makes right.
Okay.
I think we've gone beyond the might makes right narrative. We want a rules-based system that is fair, that's a level playing field, and so we need to go beyond that. So there are periods in world history when there's great contention between the great powers. And at those times, third nations do need to step up to try and resolve these challenges. So I think there are a number of ways that we can do that. One way not to do that is to believe that we can actually get in between the great powers and stand toe-to-toe against either of them in nuclear power confrontation, for instance. Totally ridiculous. But, you know, trying to sort of deal with these challenges in the international system is not in the main a challenge of arms. It's not in the main a challenge of violent confrontation. It's about diplomacy. It's about having your wits about you. It's being able to see which direction to nudge the system. So I think small nations, third nations, which are actually 80% of humanity, if we look at the United States versus China confrontation, we're the great democratic majority of the world. We are also the small nations of the world, the ones that have been economically most successful. We actually have lots of know-how. So I think that there are at least three ways we can try and repair the system. The first is to try and look for clever ways to bring about inadvertent cooperation between even great powers who are in contestation with each other. Can we collaborate on the global climate crisis, energy transition, dealing with the next pandemic? Can we deal with, sort of setting up protection systems on regulating technology? Those are things that benefit everyone. Why is it that the great powers cannot see that? Do we need third nations to stand up, put our hand up, speak truth to power and say, look, this is a problem you need to solve? Let's induce inadvertent cooperation, even if disagreement remains. We can try and nudge the great powers out of gridlock. Much, much worse than zero-sum thinking is what in economics we think of as the prisoner's dilemma, where it's a lose-lose outcome, but neither great power is able to back away for different reasons. Third nations can step in and help. And finally, third nations can try and think about pathfinder routes to resolution. We don't want to stand in between the great powers. We don't want to stand up against the great power in a battlefield, but we can think of small ways in which we can try and induce cooperation among groups of the willing that can then be examples for the great powers to come in.
Groups of the willing. It was interesting when we had COP28 here in the UAE last year. was the height of so many tensions. Everyone's like, there's no way there's going to be any agreement on anything. But in a way, it took that diplomacy, that nudging. Third powers, we're going to have a separate conversation about this because I do think the world is hierarchical. Everything from the UN Security Council abilities, if you're a NATO member, it's different if you're a non-NATO member, but we'll have that conversation after this session.
Yeah, being from
we'll have this
Singapore,
argument.
I do not believe in the hierarchy of power.
Good, okay. Tian, I want to ask you because, I mean, what we've discussed here is really fragmented diplomacy. And so how can stakeholders, be it private sector, be it civil society, be it, different actors, actually try to influence this change that takes us away from contestation that's direct to finding some of these solutions that Danny and Florence were talking about?
Yeah, so I'm usually a optimist, but on this one, I'm becoming a lot more pessimistic as we speak. And I have two hopeful cards. One is on the third nations, one is on business. So let me start with the third nations. And I think it's quite interesting how you're saying there is a hierarchy. So every other middle power countries, they are middle power. But when they're together, from the language-wise, is middle powers. But I see what Danny says in a macro sort of collective way. So let's say in a pure physics terms, the most stable scenario is a triangle. So if we have a fragmented US-China relationship, who would be that stable third pillar? I used to put my hope on Europe. I unfortunately no longer do. So who would that third pillar be? And I would argue it would be the collective of all the middle powers, or the collective of all the third nations, however we call them. But unfortunately nowadays, there are divisions within the third nations as well. So the third nations are not united and strong enough to come together and say, we've had enough, US, China, stop fighting. We want you to stop making us choose sides. We want you to come together and work on things. Think about this. People say international relationship is like marriage of conveniences, right? So we have now a couple fighting. So how do we solve that? So we would have a group of friends that come together and tell them, I don't want to hear what he says or what she says anymore. I want you to sit down together and listen. Like, we want peace to see from the two of you.
So is this counseling or intervention?
No, I think it's both. I think it's both, right? And also, I like how you say the counseling, because it's also that mentality. If people start to be in the zero-sum game, then it would be competition. Right. But if they start to be more in a collaboration way of how do we focus, like today's, our theme is collaboration in a more contested world. If we put the focus on the collaboration, then that's one direction. If we focus on the contested world, then that would be the zero-sum competition and the other direction. So I think that mentality, that counseling totally works. So that would be my first hopeful card. The other one is actually business. So because ultimately when we look at all the voters, they are very frustrated. We're all humans at the end of the day. We can talk, Danny talked about the economics can really bound people together. That is in theory. We economists believe people are rational, but no one is purely rational. We're all emotional animals in that sense, right? So people have that frustration. So they will just have to lash out their frustrations and angers in a way. And voters will pass on that to the public policies, to the politician, et cetera. So my hope would be on the business, because business are the people that genuinely are motivated to find ways, to find very creative and innovative ways to make the great powers and all the countries to work together. So you guys would be my second hopeful card.
No pressure.
Well, Sarah, I mean, it's the need for innovative approaches, right? And also to show where you can have, be it win-win or mutual beneficial pathways to collaboration. So how do you see the role of the private sector there? What innovations can you give us?
So I would say there's been a transformation in business, and I think you look back to the purpose of a company, the BRPT statement, where we are actors that have a social, environmental, and business purpose. Obviously, we're not going to be in business if we don't create returns, but we are thinking in a more broad way. So I do think what you're seeing is, regardless of what's happening at COP, business is still in, right? So we're still doing what we need to do to create a more regenerative future. And we're working not just as business, we're working as coalitions of businesses with NGOs, with our supply chain partners to kind of create better value, better shareholder value, and better shared value for people and planet. So I do think it's not just us. I think there is a coalition of businesses that are working very collaboratively together to try to create better outcomes. I would say we do advocate and we do try to create more rational policy. We're not having a tremendous amount of luck right now on trade policy, but I also feel like there are actors out there that are succeeding because they are following a model of economic integration. Like, it is joyful to me that CPTPP still exists, that the UK joined after Brexit, right? So riddle that, right? I didn't want to be part of Europe, but I want to be part of CPTPP because I actually believe economic integration and trade is a good thing and export markets matter. So there are models out there that are still working, and in some ways that is a good example because it's an example that it includes environmental, labor, digital, the kinds of things and the kinds of trade agreements that are going to address more of the issues that we are facing today as business. And so we'd like, lean in there, grow it. That, I think, creates that competitiveness, because the one thing that I will say is we've lobbied on trade for years. If you get into wonky trade policy, people, their eyes glaze over, but when you talk about other markets that are going to win because they're have more free trade agreements, they're more economically integrated, they're creating more jobs and prosperity, then oftentimes that's what creates the movement forward and the acceleration again.
Okay, I want to give an opportunity for others to ask questions. So if you have a question for the panel, please raise your hand and we will get a mic to you so you can pose your question.
Will you allow me to quickly
Yes,
join
absolutely.
ranks with Danny on this hierarchical question of power?
Sure.
You said in the beginning that this is a 19th century system, and I think it's when you look at the history, where does this idea come from that you have one power? This like hierarchical, like a hit list, only one can be number 1 and 2 and 3. That comes from the late 19th century. When the UK discovered, there's lots of other countries, and who has the most? It's a resource scarce mentality. But bear with me, we don't live in the 19th century, we live in the 21st, meaning I think we're moving towards an understanding of power that is network nature. Think of it this way, in the 19th century, you were a big power because we had loads of people, big landmass, big army, lots of money. But in the 21st century, it's about how educated is your population, not how big it is. Look at the UAE. It's not about how big your army is, but actually, do you have friends that would come and join forces with you? NATO, but other alliances. It's not about how much money you have, it's how much you trade. Do you export, do you import, et cetera, et cetera. So I think actually in that system, and you used the word influence earlier instead of power, which I found quite interesting. I think we're looking at the geopolitics of influence without an Instagram account. And if you look at it that way, then you also break out of this, who's number 1? Is it China? Is it US? Is it this country or the other? In fact, you have, you more influence, the more network you have, the more relations you have, the more influence you have in that system. And then we can put a stop to this, who's actually the biggest rooster in this room.
So influence gives you leverage, and that leverage allows you to
Exactly.
absolutely meet some of your interests. I would still argue that the hierarchy is not necessarily 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but there is a small grouping of countries that have the ability to push that influence, leverage, power, and they then trickle that down. So I think NATO, without the US, is a very different grouping than with the US. But a conversation to be continued. We have a question right over here, so if we can please get a mic here, if you could kindly identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Yuva Naidu. I'm from the Global Future Council on the Future of Job Creation. Joseph Nye famously said it's not just about hard power or soft power, it's about smart power. In this world, which is increasingly difficult to navigate, what advice do you have for countries that may be low or middle income to navigate this ecosystem with smart power?
Okay, you go on?
Yeah, I'll give it a try. I think, and I agree with you, Mina, about what you said about, there are some countries that have more influence, but it's changing. You know, like the book, I think the title is stupid, but The Rise of the Rest. Already, you know, you see the rise and the decline. Let's get rid of rise and decline narrative. But there are countries that have loads of other things at their disposal that they can use if you think of it in terms of influence and network. I would say create relationships, create friendships, ideally equal, you know, not somebody who has more or less, but, you know, peers, relationships with peers, create trust, and create a network around you. I think that would be my recommendation. I mean, at the end of the day, what NATO is a network of friends that say, okay, we're going to hang out together when the tough gets going gets tough. But you get the idea. I think that would be my recommendation, and really break out of this thinking that, you know, there's one state that you have to be close to. There's plenty of other states. That's the interesting thing about the 21st century, that the capacity to have diplomatic relations, to have all kinds of relations, has grown. 100 years ago, 50 years ago, you would not have that conversation because simply no state below a certain level of income would have been capable of having such relations. So that would be my recommendation.
And that's definitely one, as you said, the UAE you can look at in terms of just that network and friendships and the signing of CEPAs, which is our version of kind of free trade agreements with countries large and small. Danny, you wanted to comment on this.
If I may, the concept of soft power is a wonderful invention. It's helped us understand so much of the world. But the world that we're moving into is one that does not lend itself easily to such convenient hierarchies once and for all. It needs to be fit for purpose. What are we trying to achieve with the dimensions that we're measuring? So let me give you an example. Which are the nations that take the best care of their people? Is it the world's most powerful nations? Is it the nations that have the greatest number of nuclear weapons, greatest number of soldiers, largest military, or is it something else? So just a simple exercise. Suppose that we measure taking care of your people by how much income you generate for your people, right, per person. Who are the world's richest countries? It's not the world's big powers. It's not the world's great military nations. Of the 9 richest nations, by that measure, the United States does appear for the reasons of its incredible wealth. But for the other 8 nations there, their average population is only 4 million. It's less than the population of Singapore. It's comparable to the state of Dubai. Dubai is 3.8 million people. That's the average size of the world's most successful countries. So if you're taking care of your people, that's what we want to look at. If you're involved in a confrontation where we're protecting our planet from invasion from Mars, yes, I want the United States to be standing out there. But it's what purpose we're trying to get these measures of power for. I don't think soft power or smart power is any longer a valuable concept.
Thank you. There's a question over here, if we can please get a mic. Sure.
Kia ora, I'm Pania from New Zealand. I have a question for anyone, really. Given what we've spoken about so far this afternoon, are we suggesting it might be time to review the rules-based system? Is it being used in a constructive way? So what we're seeing, I mean, that was established post-World War II. The world has evolved. So that's number one. Do we need to, for the foreign policy people, I'm not saying get rid of rules. I'm just saying, is it time for it to evolve? Number two, and I say this with the utmost respect, we've seen recently a number of the international bodies appear to be toothless, and I say that with respect. Number three, we are also starting to see an emergence of blocs because they are being blocked. Look at what's happening with BRICS. So you've got countries saying, well, you don't want us over here, so we'll go and join over here. I just wonder, is it time for us to have a look at the system? Kia ora.
Thank you. So we'll come back to that question. We'll just take this one and then we'll get your thoughts from the panel, please.
Yeah, thanks. It was a very insightful discussion. So my question is that the way we are seeing the geopolitics play out, is it a reflection of the emergence of a set of leaders that we are seeing now who have a much more nationalist approach?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so is it time to review the international system?
I'll take a stab at this.
Okay.
There's a common complaint about the rules-based system that says, well, those who design the rules design them to make it advantageous for them. Mm-hmm. And I fully accept that criticism. I am a supporter of the concept of a rules-based system in the sense that it is a rules-based system that guarantees a level playing field, clarity and transparency with which nations deal with each other. It is a rules-based system that guarantees peaceful resolution of disputes. It's a rules-based system that allows small nations to stand toe-to-toe against great powers on the domains that are of interest to us. So I'm not so keen on giving up the rules-based system, but what I've described would be a system of multilateralism. So if we were to engage in this conversation, I say we need to make multilateralism great again.
But if it's toothless, or if it's, because if the theory is there, but there's no way to enforce it, which takes us back to the might conversation, what happens?
I don't think we're toothless. I think that there is sometimes there's this view, which has been around for 2,000 years, that says the great powers do what they will, the rest of us suffer what we must. That's the sense in which we worry that when the great powers check out, we're at the whim of everybody else. But I don't think that that's really the state of humanity in the 21st century. It's one that recognizes we face common challenges, and we need to describe, articulate, mobilize on these common challenges in a way that brings people together in a rules-based multilateral system.
I agree.
I'm going to let Tian just respond and then come to you, because
Which one did
you were
you
nodding
want?
me to be. Well, is a reflection of the leaders.
I'm happy to take that one first, or we can
Okay.
talk about the other. I think that's a great question about rising nationalistic politicians and how that's making the world more fragmented. I would actually say, put the question in reverse, that the rising nationalist politicians are a result of the fragmented world. Especially because of the trade and the lack of benefit of many individuals, that people have been voting for politicians that want to be more protective of their own countries. And on that, again, is not the rules-based international system itself is wrong. I'd more argue that on top of that, like free trade itself is good for every country, because as an economist, because everyone would benefit from your own comparative advantage. So that itself is never wrong. The problem is more the redistribution system that have failed. So for every country collectively, when they win from the international trade, what they need to do is that within that country, certain parties and stakeholders or voters, they have benefited a lot more than the others. Some of these others may have gained a little, or they have completely lost out from that. Then the domestic policy would also need to ensure that these people have not completely lost out. And I would argue that in the past, several decades, the international trade itself is something for us to discuss, but we have not discussed enough of the domestic redistribution factors. And that is not about the rules-based international system itself, but also, very importantly, the domestic factors.
Okay, Sarah, you wanted to respond?
I was gonna make the same point, which is it's not trade, it's the response to trade. And if we're not investing in people, education, skills, technology, and infrastructure, then it's very hard to see how you're going to be a competitive nation, and then you have these disruptions. And I would argue that's in some ways what we've seen in the United States. On the rules-based system, I think if you threw them all out, we'd have to reinvent them. I mean, we may be getting there, that we get to this point of like chucking it all and then we make it all come back. I do think the functioning of the rules could work better. Certainly in trade, like I'm not sure we're going to do a consensus-based system going forward on trade. It's too hard, it's too big. We need better systems for making decisions to make sure that the rules are upgraded. to make sure that they're reflective of all of the new challenges and the new opportunities.
2 points. One on the blocks. I really don't like the narrative around, oh, it's a new Cold War and we have new blocks. Because during the Cold War, the blocks were not talking to each other at all. There was no trade really. There was no people-to-people exchange. Now we live in a world where we can disagree on one thing, like you can still visit each other, trade with each other. So, and also you have, a few days ago you had a meeting between the EU and the GCC when, you know, the Gulf is clearly doing its whole other thing. So I think the Gulf does not want to be part of any bloc. So maybe we, you know, in the spirit of a network, we say we have nodes or clusters, but I don't want us to fall into the trap of thinking in terms of blocks. Then on the system, come back to science fiction. A dominant theme in science fiction, I don't know if you've seen The Expanse, where the United Nations is the world government, and then they go into space and it gets really complicated. In space, they have the same issues. But the idea that the world has a world government and we're all at peace with each other is a very common feature, but we're very far away from it. So what we have right now is super imperfect, but it's the best we got. So even if we threw it away and we invented it again, we would come up with the same. The flaw of the system is that it's anarchic. There is nobody who can enforce it. And I will say, despite the narrative that it's never been as bad as now, the elephant in the room, the invasion of Iraq, 2003, a major ally of NATO broke international law. There's been numerous other instances. So this is not the first time we see this challenge. That doesn't mean it's right. But it still means that we will have to accept, and that's why it's called rules, not laws. The rules remain the norm. Every time somebody breaks the rules, ideally somebody responds to it. But within their capacity and within their priorities, they will or will not do that. And we can decry that, but I think ultimately that is still the ideal we should live up to.
I'm so sad to say that we've run out of time because there is a lot to pick up from all the points that were raised. Importantly, what the future looks like, and we're here at the Global Future Councils to talk about the future. Disruption, contestation, but also knowing that we'd have to make it all up again if we were to scrap what we have. So we might as well try to reform what we have rather than overthrow it. Thank you all for being here with us in the room. Thanks to the amazing panel, and thank you for tuning in.